Hello and welcome to Book Breaks. We are so thrilled to have you here today as we welcome Fareed Zakaria. We'll talk about his book, Age of Revolutions, Progress and Backlash from 1600 to the Present. And we'd like to thank Citizen Travelers, the nonpartisan civic engagement initiative of the Travelers Company, for their continued support of Book Breaks. And we'd also like to thank viewers like you for tuning in every week. And another plug, want to remind you to join the History School Book Club, which is a perfect resource for any high school student looking for a fun way to explore American history. If you have any interest in that, you can email bookbreaks@gilderlehrman.org. And I'm your host, Gina Oppenheim, and I'm joined by my friend Ryan, who will be taking your questions in the second half. And without further ado, we are so thrilled to welcome Fareed Zakaria, who is the host of Fareed Zakaria GPS on CNN and a columnist for the Washington Post and best-selling author. Fareed, welcome. We're so thrilled to have you here today.
It's my pleasure, Gina.
Yeah, so I was wondering, just starting off, if you can give us an overview of this book and what it's about.
Sure. One way to do it is to tell you how I started to think about it. About 10 years ago, believe it or not, it took me a while to get this done. About 10 years ago, I started to notice that our politics seemed to be getting upended. The Tea Party phenomenon happened, and where the Republican Party, this normally very hierarchical party, was being taken over by a kind of insurgency. And they believed they were animated by things completely different from the normal Republican Party. They didn't care about free trade and balanced budgets and low government spending. No, they were talking about immigration and protectionism and trade and a lot of it about the reaction to the first Black president and the fears about an increasingly diverse America. And I thought to myself, boy, this is interesting. You're seeing a complete kind of shift in politics, a realignment. And why is it happening? And I began to think, well, we've been going through so much change. Maybe it's easier for me to see because I came from India, but you think about the waves of globalization, information technology, these massive kind of identity revolutions that have been shaping our politics. And I thought, when has this happened in the past? I mean, this is my instinct to always because I was trained, I did my undergraduate degree in history, but my PhD in political science. But in those days, political science still was a lot of history. And so I started to look back in similar periods in history where you've had, what one might call structural changes, these big changes in the basis of the economy, the nature of technology, which then have a spillover effect. And I started to ask myself, when you looked at these previous eras, what happened to the politics? How did it look? And I began to notice there was a real pattern that every time you had these big, broad structural changes to the economy, to technology, you saw a bunch of things happen. You always saw an identity revolution. So you go back to the Dutch, which is my first case. The Dutch go through this process, and after, as a result, becoming richer, they begin to think of themselves differently. They think of themselves, we're not part of the Habsburg Empire. We're Dutch, and they declare independence from the Habsburg Empire. They begin to think to themselves, we're not just Christians, we're Protestants, and that has some very important political meaning. And there's always a backlash. There's always a group of people who say this is too far, too fast. Stop the train, I want to get off. And even in the 17th century in the Netherlands, you had a party that was formed that said, we've had too much change, we've disturbed the old way of doing things too much. We're going to take you back. We're going to make the Netherlands great again. So that politics of nostalgia is very much part of the pattern of modern political history. And so I tried to put it all together, and I decided to do a book that was sort of, the first half of it is all the history of these revolutions and how they kind of unfolded, and the consequences, the sort of identity revolution, the political revolution, the backlash. And then the second half is a description of the four great revolutions we're going through. And I try to end with some thoughts about where we are today. So it was an enormous fun to write. It took a while because there was a lot of real historical research, and doing it while while having a full-time job took a while.
I
So.
can understand that. Now, in the opening chapter, you contextualize the word liberal in a historical context. I'm wondering if you could do that for our viewers, because I thought it was really fascinating how you did that.
Yeah, so the whole thing begins, by the way, that the idea of the left versus the right is a consequence of the French Revolution. And if I can, I'll tell just a funny story that I learned while
Please,
doing the
yeah.
book. So the reason we call people left wing and right wing and left of center and right of center is all because of an architect named Pierre Adrien Paris, who was given the task of housing the French National Assembly in Versailles, and he was trying to figure out how to do it, and he began to make some moves at it, and then basically the whole National Assembly moves to Paris, and because now things are heating up and they need to meet all the time, and the room is given as a rectangle. In the old days, the National Assembly met in a kind of amphitheater, and it was just open seating. People sat by their rank, the priests first, the aristocracy second, and the people, commoners last. But now what starts to happen is when you have this rectangular room, he puts the two rows, left of the chair and right of the chair, and people start hanging out with the people they agree with politically. And the people who agreed with the idea of getting rid of the monarchy tended to sit on the left-hand side of the chair. And the people who wanted to uphold the French monarchy ended up sitting on the right-hand side of the chair. And that stuck for 300 years. It has still stuck, this idea that there's a left and a right. And when I say left, and I mean liberal, it really comes out of that struggle, which is liberalism. Modern liberalism was the movement that was against the absolute monarchy, for individual rights, for individual freedom, against a state that was dominated by the church and a state religion, in favor of individual worship expression. So in our political spectrum, mostly for the last certainly 100 years, both political parties have been liberal in that sense, have been classical liberals. Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton were both classical liberals. Reagan would have put a little more emphasis on the economic liberty aspect of it. Clinton would have put more emphasis on the social liberty aspect of it. But they were both liberals. We are, for the first time, witnessing kind of anti-liberal forces within our politics. In America, in Europe, you're seeing people who say, the Speaker of the House today is Mike Johnson says, I think separation of church and state was a mistake and the founding fathers didn't really mean it. Things like obviously the attacks on elections, on the independence of courts, all that kind of thing. So we're seeing for the first time something that I would call anti-liberal or illiberal. Broadly speaking, as you know, in Europe, they refer to liberal in the more old-fashioned sense, where people from both the left and right who are broadly in this, coming out, the heirs of the Enlightenment are all kind of called liberal.
Yeah, and can you tell us about the liberal revolution that occurred in the Netherlands? Because I'd mentioned that is one of my favorite parts of the book.
Yeah, it was totally fascinating to me to learn about all that. So, if you think of human history, mostly, certainly after the fall of the Roman Empire, it was basically unmitigated, what Hobbes called, life will be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And if you look at per capita GDP, it's like a straight line. There's no movement for hundreds and hundreds of years. And then you suddenly see the first uptick. And the first uptick in average income for people on the planet happens in this tiny place, the Netherlands, in the northwestern corner of Europe. Why? Because the people in the Netherlands, it's the classic case of the kind of the poor striving hustler against the kind of trust fund kids. Netherlands had no good agricultural land. It had very poor conditions for agriculture at all because it's cold, it's windswept, it's rainy, and you keep losing land to the sea all the time. So they had to hustle. They had to figure out how to use technology and brain power and innovate rather than extract gold from, say, Latin America, which is what the Spanish were doing. And so they've become the first modern nation in that sense. They find a path to wealth that is through brain power. And they innovate on land management, water management. They innovate in terms of navigation, tall ships, invent globalization. They invent the stock market. The first stock market is in the Netherlands. The first multinational corporation, the Dutch East Indies Company, is in Netherlands. All of that produces the richest country in the world in this tiny little place. And it produces a different kind of politics as well, because as I was saying, they think of themselves now as different. They're Dutch, they're Protestant, and they're more open. Because they want the smartest people from everywhere. They are more tolerant because they want to maximize the talent, for example, of the Jews. They are more outward looking than inward looking. And all those qualities make for a kind of liberal revolution where you have the first modern economy and you have the first modern polity, because the politics of the Dutch Republic, unlike, again, you go back hundreds of years in Europe, it's not courts, it's not kings, it's essentially a merchant republic where the richest landowning business types are the ones who definitely are the ones enfranchised and others are not. But within that, it's a fairly pluralistic system where there has to be collective leadership and collective management. And so for all of those reasons, it marks a huge break in human history and particularly in Western history. And it's the beginning of what we now know as the 500-year rise of the West.
And now, with all this being said, why didn't the Netherlands become a bigger superpower? Because they had such innovation.
It's a great question. I think there are a couple of things going on. One, there is a kind of cycle where you get richer and you get lazier and you rest on your laurels a little bit. But the other part is that it was geographically so small and so vulnerable that it never had the ability to really stabilize and become independent. So what happens eventually is that the French invaded. And when the French invaded, the Dutch experiment, as it were, really collapses. And the reason that we think of we think of it still as being the precursor to something very powerful that continued is because it got transplanted to Britain around the same time through the Glorious Revolution. If not for that, it's a very good question you ask. A kind of fascinating what if of history is what would have happened if there had been no Glorious Revolution, if William of Orange had not moved from the Netherlands to Britain. Well, I mean, the Netherlands kind of had a pretty bad 100 years after the French invasion. And might not, we might not all be liberals today. We might still be in a world of kings and courts and established churches and aristocracy and hierarchy.
Yeah, and for our teachers in the audience, it's a great research project for your students too to look into. And now, what were the consequences of the failed French Revolution? So you write a lot about that as well.
So to explain to begin with why I say it failed, because I think you have to be honest about. There are some people who think it didn't fail, but I argue it failed because it failed on its own terms to begin with. The French Revolution begins with the ending of the monarchy. It ends with Napoleon crowning himself emperor. So on its own terms, it failed. But it failed more broadly because it created a highly unstable politics in France that never managed to create the kind of consistent and continuous form of constitutional government that you saw in Britain and then the United States. I mean, if you think about Britain and the United States, other than the English Civil War, which happens before the Glorious Revolution in the early 17th century, Britain and the United States have had continuous constitutional government for 350 years. In that same period, France has had an absolute monarchy, then a revolution, then 5 republics, 2 empires, a crypto-fascist dictatorship during World War II. It's a lot, right? And so that by definition is not a stable political system. So why did it happen? Fundamentally, unlike the Dutch, where the politics changed as economics and society was changing, in France, you had a very agrarian country, not particularly modernized, not particularly oriented towards trade or merchants. So the Netherlands, for example, is 50% urban by the end of the 17th century. France is basically 10% urban. It's still a big, old, agricultural, aristocratic, feudal system. And then you have a bunch of intellectuals who say, we're going to transform this country and we're going to push down all these changes. Liberté, égalité, fraternité. We're going to force a new system on the French public. And it doesn't take. And it morphs into terror, and it morphs into dictatorship, and then it morphs into empire. And so to me, one of the lessons there is when political change happens as a consequence of broader societal changes. You create a merchant class. That merchant class demands more rights. You create more secularism and alternatives to the church, and those require freedom of worship. Those things tend to stick and endure. When it all comes top down, like the French Revolution, like the Bolshevik Revolution, like the Iranian Revolution, it has much more difficulty genuinely sticking, enduring, and transforming the society.
Yeah, and the final revolution that you really cover in depth is the Industrial Revolution. I was wondering how you decided to go there. Sort of you had done countries and then sort of more of a concept.
Because it's really the most important revolution so far. I would argue we're probably living through the most important one, but we don't have historical perspective on it. But certainly, other than what we're going through now, as Eric Hobsbawm, the great historian, says, the Industrial Revolution is probably the most important event in human history, because it is the moment at which you have this real break from that millennia of poverty that I'm describing, and you have the real break from the kind of way in which human societies were organized. And you can see this if you just plot per capita GDP. As I said, it goes like a flat line, a little bit of a bump with Netherlands, Britain, and then boom, it goes like a hockey stick. So we go from about $300 per capita GDP to I think we're at about 5,000 now, worldwide average. That shift happens because of the Industrial Revolution. And it's when all those things I was talking about, knowledge, brain power, invention, technology, transform the economies. And because it happens first in Britain, and Britain is the superpower of the age of the 18th and 19th century, it spreads all over the world. It spreads everywhere. It's widespread to the United States, for example. And that reality defined the modern world. When we think of modernity today, we are all living in the world created by the Industrial Revolution. Our politics comes out of the world of the Industrial Revolution, both the revolution itself and the critics of the revolution, both from the left, which is what spawns communism, Marxism, social democracy, socialism, all of that, and of course the romanticism that viewed the Industrial Revolution as horrible, which spawns at some level the kind of cultural conservatism that we are all familiar with, the politics of nostalgia, and also, of course, fascism, which is in its own way a kind of weaponized politics of nostalgia. All of that is a reaction to the Industrial Revolution.
What way was coal the center of this revolution?
Pardon?
What way was coal the center of it?
So the most important thing, in many ways, the Industrial Revolution is an energy revolution, because at heart, at the core, what is happening in the Industrial Revolution is you are inventing machines, and those machines can do wonders if they can be powered by inanimate forms of energy, because you're finding that there's only so many horses you can attach to the carriage. They used to do 2 and then 4 and 6 and 8 and 12. And then, you realize that if you want to really go 40 miles an hour, and they'd come up with some of the technology, but you need something that can power those wheels. And it turned out that coal was the magical source of energy. Obviously, people realized that wood was the source, but coal was even more efficient, much more dense, and therefore much more usable, transportable. And Britain had tons of coal. And that is one of the reasons. I would argue not the only reason that British inventiveness deserves an important mention. but the widespread abundance of coal. And by the way, the reason they ended up using coal is, again, this so much of this happens accidentally. The king doesn't want them cutting down all his forests, and so they're like, okay, we can't use wood, so what else do we have? And they dig around and they find coal. And that is why the coal ends up powering the Industrial Revolution. The second, what is often called the Second Industrial Revolution, um, is also in a way an energy revolution. It is the switch from coal to petroleum. And it happens in the late 19th century. And it's the moment at which, in a way, you see that second wave of countries, Germany and the United States being the most important ones, take off.
Now, you mentioned this briefly. If you could tell us a little more how America piggybacked off of England during this time period.
It will sound very there are a lot of historical parallels that you can imagine today. So basically, the British just copied the Americans just copied a lot of what the British were doing. Look, these were mostly Englishmen anyway. They had strong ties back there. They would go back and forth. They'd hear stories about these factories, these way in which textiles, for example, were being handled, and they would go there and they would look. So the Lowells, Francis, I think capital, Francis Lowell, Lowell, Massachusetts, the town is named after the family, basically took a trip in Britain and looked at, very carefully observed and wrote down all the layouts and the organization of British textile factories. And he came back here and he just copied them all. After a while, there were copyrights put in place and there was all these protections. The Americans followed none of it. In fact, Charles Dickens came to the United States on a lecture tour, and he was horrified by the fact that his book was absolutely widely published in the United States, absolutely widely read, and he never got a dime out of any of it. And he said, "I'm never coming back to this country again." He was appalled by it. So think about all the things we say about China now, the British said about America then.
United States.
Now, to be fair, there then was a lot of other stuff that helped America. Basically, if you were looking for a key to success in the Netherlands, Britain, US, it does seem to be that decentralized power makes a huge difference. So the Netherlands was the most first, the Netherlands and Britain are the most decentralized parts of the Roman Empire. So when Roman authority collapses after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, those are the parts that are the most kind of disaggregated, lots of little groups competing with one another. America, wide open spaces, very, very decentralized. That seems to help a lot. And that, combined with America's size, makes America this extraordinary, success story. And then with the second industrial revolution, America lucks out as Britain did, because there turned out to be lots of oil in America. And so that further fuels and powers the American economy.
Well, and you mentioned early on about the left and right story, and I was wondering if you had any other moments in your research that you just loved, whether you included them in the book or not.
Yeah, I think that a similar kind of story I was totally fascinated by with the Industrial Revolution, because it shows you how these kind of structural changes upend the old politics. So when you started the Industrial Revolution, the left was basically in favor of it and the right was against it. Why? Because the right in Britain, think about, the old right, the old 18th century right. These were people who were in favor of the king, the church, and the aristocracy. And the Industrial Revolution, of course, begins, and it's not happening in London. It's mostly happening in the North. And it's these inventors, it's these poor guys, and they're often not educated. In Britain, unlike in other places, like in France and Germany, it's not the scientists doing it. It's the tinkerers, it's the inventors. These are basically just people who have a knack for making stuff work, what we would today call entrepreneurs. And they start to break up the old social hierarchy because they're becoming super successful, they're becoming super rich, they're demanding rights, they're demanding status. And the left looks at this and says, this is great. We're breaking down aristocracy, we're breaking down the power of the monarchy, we're breaking down the power of the church. There was this whole movement in the 19th century to disestablish the Church of England, which led to the second longest word in the English language, disestablishmentarianism, which is There were the people who wanted to disestablish. No, sorry, the second longest word is anti-disestablishmentarianism. The people who wanted to disestablish it were called the disestablishmentarians. The people who want against that, the conservatives, were anti-disestablishmentarianism.
And I won't ask you to say that fast.
By the end of the 19th century, the roles have flipped. And you see this in the person of somebody like John Stuart Mill, who starts out very enthusiastic about all these changes and ends up very despondent. Because what's happened is the left has realized that while you did break down all those old hierarchies, you created new ones with these plutocrats at the top, and you were creating conditions of mass difficulty. I don't want to say mass poverty because there was a lot of rural poverty, but you're creating a great deal of distress in the factories and in the poorhouses and things like that. And so the left starts to move toward the idea that the Industrial Revolution needs to be regulated. The right, meanwhile, finds, okay, the old hierarchy is gone, but there's a new hierarchy, and we're kind of pro-hierarchy. And we can attach ourselves to this new hierarchy just as well. And the right begins to become pro markets and business and industry and things like that. And you see this complete transformation that takes place. And so the right by the 1910s is now basically in favor of no government, lots of business, and the left is now all in favor of regulation business. The interesting kind of pivotal or transitional figure, transitional is the right word, is Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt is the last Republican to argue for the regulation of business. And as you can see, he splits the Republican Party in 1912, and he ends up in political wilderness because his views essentially become those of the Democratic Party rather than the Republican Party.
Fascinating. Now, are there any hidden figures that you feel like maybe your book will bring to light for students, any individuals who might not be as well known?
It's mostly the Dutch as a story rather than any individual within it, because the whole story of the Dutch is there's no one hero. It was a collective effort and was a collective enterprise. In fact, the funny thing about the Dutch for that whole period and into much later, there was no leader. There was no king. There was somebody they call a staatsholder, but that just meant he was like the chairman of the committee that decided these things. So even William of Orange, he was not the king of the Netherlands. He was called a prince because he came from a royal family or an aristocratic family, but he had no power. And that's kind of why he was willing to leave the Netherlands and go to Britain. So it's a fascinating story in and of itself that I think people need to know more about.
Absolutely. Well, before I pass you over to Ryan, just was wondering what you hope readers take away upon finishing the book.
Well, the first thing, which I always hope with all my books, is that people understand that in order to understand the present, you have to understand the past. That, the way I sort of think about it is, we're not scientists. Like, scientists can manipulate variables and say, let's do more of this and less of this. We can't do that in social science and history and in contemporary affairs. All we can do is say, well, let's look back to a time when something similar happened, and what can we learn from it? Or, well, let's look back to a time when some of these forces were at play, and what can we learn from them? And I feel like this is such a powerful example of how the past informs the present. And the second thing is I think, to get some sense of appreciation and wonder for the journey that we have been on as human beings, that we've managed to achieve so much in terms of liberating people and, giving people more autonomy and dignity and individual rights and freedom, and it's been a bumpy road. There have been setbacks, but not to let the setbacks make you too despondent, because overall it's a story of enormous progress, I think.
Yeah, and that's especially a timely message for today. And with that, I'm going to pass you back to Ryan, who's going to do our Student Scholar Question of the Week. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Gina, for that great interview. It was awesome to hear. And we're going to begin this part of the program, as we always do, with our History Scholar Question of the Week. And just as a reminder, I know we might have a lot of newer folks today. This is a weekly competition in which students have an opportunity to submit a question, and the winning question will be read aloud to our esteemed guest. And in addition to that, the winner will receive a gift card to our great Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History gift shop for themselves and their teacher, an amount of $50. And this week, our winner is Thomas, who's a student at Stuyvesant High School in our neck of the woods. And it's a very good question, as usual. So thank you, Thomas. Throughout history, revolutions have been driven by technological advancements, from the printing press to the industrial machinery. How do you see modern technologies like AI and even the internet driving new forms of revolution today? Could they result in political or economic changes similar to the revolutions that you talk about in your book?
That is a great question. And that's a great school, Stuyvesant. I think that we are living through possibly the most revolutionary of these periods. And I say that for two reasons. One, if you think about the two fundamental drivers, economics and technology, that have been transforming society since the Dutch. On the economic side, we've been living through the biggest expansion of the global economy in history. If you think about, say, for the 1940s and 50s, when the global economy really is born, every 10 years, one or two new countries would join, as it were. Japan in the 1950s, South Korea in the 1960s. But these were 30, 40, 50, 60 million people. Then there was, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore. We're talking about 5-7 million people. In the last 30 years, we've had India, China, Vietnam, Indonesia, Brazil. You put that all together, that's like 3.5 billion people joining the global economy. So the Big Bang effect, and that's one of the reasons I think we've been so, our politics has been so roiled by the so-called China shock, but it's really the globalization shock, because if it wasn't China, the jobs would have gone to, a combination of Bangladesh and Vietnam and India and all that. But that's seismic. And then the second is this whole information revolution that has completely changed the nature of business, so that not just the change of the nature of business, the change the nature of life, in all kinds of ways that, I think everybody understands. But the ultimate version is AI. Because with AI, you have the first technology that potentially we don't control. It controls itself. It may even control us. What do I mean by that? Let me give you one example. Imagine you're fighting a war 10 years from now. And you're beginning to see this on the battlefield in Ukraine and Russia already. In order to win the war, you want your drones to be reacting faster, going further, doing whatever it takes to defeat their drones. But in order to do that, you need to take the human being out of the loop. You need to have the AI systems, drone that are enabled by AI. You just give them direction, go and destroy the Russian army. And you've got to let them do it fast, rapid fire, faster than the Russian drones are doing, which means the last thing you're going to have is that, keep coming back to General so-and-so and saying, is it okay for me to? Mm-hmm. No, you got to go. So what you are now doing is creating killing machines that are not fundamentally under human control and might be killing drones, but also might be killing human beings. So the machines are now controlling us. We've never seen that in human history before. So that tells me that we are really in a period of much greater revolutionary change than people realize. I mean, we've been living through it. It's been roiling our politics, but I think it's worth taking a moment to think about that. And I myself think so many of these indicators, the rise of populism, the extraordinary rise of loneliness that people have, the extraordinary rise of teen suicide, has something to do with this. We are really, the level of uncertainty and flux and churn in life has just gotten so much higher.
Yes, absolutely. Great answer. And thank you, Thomas, for that great question. Our chat is blowing up, so I'll get to as many as I can. Sam says, I'm in the middle of this great book and thoroughly enjoying it. I haven't finished it yet. Of the political revolutions you focus on, you seem to examine violent revolutions in your case study, and yet the second half of the 20th century saw a tremendous amount of increase in nonviolent revolutions around the world, perhaps most famously the Eastern European overthrow of Soviet domination. Could you talk about the increase in nonviolent revolutions? Is this something we could hopefully aspire to in the future, et cetera?
It's a great question. And I would say that one of the stories of the last 100 years has really been the rise and dominance of liberal norms that have made nonviolent revolution much more attractive and much more successful. Give you a simple example of the country I grew up in. Gandhi was a genius in using nonviolent revolution to overthrow British rule in India. But I think it's fair to say this would not have worked in Germany during the same period of time. In other words, it was because Britain was fundamentally a liberal, an Anglo-American liberal power, that you could shock its conscience. You could shock the people in England. And it wasn't just that, by the way. They also had to lose 2 world wars and feel bankrupt. And, so I'm not trying to sugarcoat, but all of it came together, and you would not have been able to do that if not for the rise of Anglo-American liberalism. Since 45, of course, the United States has been the great Anglo-American liberal power, and it created an international system with a lot more rules and norms. And, we may say, yeah, we can think of all the exceptions, but think about this. And there's a wonderful book by a Yale Law School professor documenting this. Since 1945, the Russian war of aggression in Ukraine will be the first, if it's successful, will be the first case of naked aggression, territorial conquest, and change of borders by force that is then ratified. So it's very rare since 1945 to have this kind of aggression work and pay off. So we have managed within this umbrella a lot more nonviolent change, a lot more liberal revolutions. Obviously, the '89 ones being the most clear. But so many of the decolonization movements involve small amounts or minimal amounts of violence. And again, lots of bad examples: Vietnam, Iraq. I don't want to gloss over, but there was a broad shift that took place. And the great question I worry about is if the United States pulls out of the world, if this liberal order crumbles, will we be able to look back 50 years from now and say, yeah, all those trends continued, or will we be returning to a kind of a more 19th century world of freelancing great powers doing whatever they can?
Fascinating. Thank you so much for that great question and answer. Adam and a few others in our chat asked an interesting question that's could be worthy of a dissertation, but I'm asking for a shorter answer here. Why, especially for our students, why do you think non-Western nations didn't follow the exact same path developmentally as the West, since the 19th century?
Yeah, that is a dissertation question. So I think that there were a series of things that went right in the Western world, and many of them were accidents. So why does, for example, Europe rise? Again, huge question, but I would argue that you have to start with geography. The geography of Europe encourages competition. If you think about Europe, it's lots of little rivers and mountain ranges creating lots of little different political units. So in 1500, Europe had about 500 different, let's call them political units, so duchies, all nations, republics. They were all called different things, but they were independent political entities. If you look at Asia, on the other hand, it's a vast, flat plains and steppes. So that encourages highly centralized rule. Think of Russia as the perfect example, but the Chinese Empire, the Genghis, the Mongol Empire, and that competition in the Western world produced a lot of innovation. A lot of it was competition around war, by the way, which is why the West was particularly good at military innovation, military technology, which then allowed them to conquer the rest of the world. But it was a lot of non-military as well. So you look at the scientific revolution that takes place in the West, the Enlightenment that takes place, all these things happen in the West. After a while, the East, I'm just putting it generically, the East decides we got to get in on the action. We got to copy. But it's very hard when you don't have that long history of things propelling you in that direction. But they try. Japan being the first case after the Meiji Restoration. And after that, you begin to see more and more do. And now they do. But you will notice an interesting thing. A lot of countries have been able to go from being poor to being middle income. That's roughly speaking, a few $100 per capita income a year, average income a year, to 6,000, 7,000. Getting from $7,000 or $8,000 per capita to about 25, which is what you define a rich country at. There are very few countries that have managed it. It's Japan, South Korea, and then the tiny countries of Singapore, Hong Kong, if you count that as a country, Taiwan, if you count that as a country. And I think that may be it. Maybe you could add Chile to that list, right? But Chile is sort of Western. So it's extraordinary how even with all that ability to copy, you're kind of stuck in that range. China is right now stuck at about $12,000 per capita. And I think it'll grow, but it'll grow much more slowly than people realize. Because at that level, you have to now modernize every element of your society, your legal system, your political system, your social system. And there are many parts of these countries that remain in some way or the other tied to the old ways of doing things.
Fascinating. As we mentioned before we signed on, we have so many teachers and students on the call today, and many more will watch the recording of this in our archive. And many teachers, especially, might be very keen to use this great book in the classroom, integrated into their lesson plans if they're teaching an AP Civics course or some type of history course. And would just love to hear from you, like, how would you recommend using this great book in the classroom? Is there a particular chapter, or what kind of theme do you think really this dovetails nicely with? And again, I'll just a quick reminder: there's links in the chat to get your hands on this great book, and we recommend everyone in our network do so.
So I would think of, obviously, I'd be thrilled if it was. My previous books have been used, and it's probably the thing I derive the most satisfaction from, honestly, for all the things that I notice from having good reviews, being a New York Times bestseller. It's the number of courses in which the book has been adopted in high school and in colleges. So I think The Future of Freedom, I wrote in 2003. I think there's still 400 different courses in high school and colleges they're used in, which gives me enormous pleasure. It's kind of why you do this kind of thing. Look, I think that at one level, it's kind of trying to explain the modern world. Why are we the way we are? Why does the world look the way it does? And if you think of it in those terms and think about the impact of the Industrial Revolution, so I would think that piece of it, the Industrial Revolution and the creation of the modern age and our revolutions would be a great place to go. I will say I'm particularly proud of the Dutch and the French chapters, because I guarantee you there are hundreds, thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of very detailed, complicated history. I've read them all, so you don't have to. So I think my summary of the French Revolution is, in my opinion, the best 40-page summary of the French Revolution you're ever going to get, and it's very reader-friendly. The same is true for the Dutch. So that's a second way that you could use it. And I did it very much thinking about it in those terms. So, with the French Revolution, it's such a complicated story. I decided to talk about three characters: Lafayette, Robespierre, and Napoleon. I thought, like, if there are three names people will know out of the French Revolution, so it's actually two. Lafayette, I have to thank Hamilton. So now people know who Lafayette, but he's a very important symbol in the French Revolution, because he's the liberal. It's the revolution that didn't happen. Robespierre is the revolution that did happen. And Napoleon is where the revolution ended up with an emperor.
Wow, fascinating. We have several questions in the chat that are all kind of related to similar things. So I'll try to see if I can combine them. If you could just talk a little bit about how attacks on minorities and also feminism theory, I believe you talk about some of that in your book. How are those themes in this great book? That certainly lots of places for you to talk about, but if you could talk a little bit about that.
It's a very important question, because change, the kind of change I'm talking about, huge, massive change, a lot of it is very abstract, right? How do you see massive expansion of global trade in services, global shifts of capital flows, the rise of supply chains in which things are being manufactured in different places, cross-border investment. This is all the stuff that's completely changed the world. How do you even see the digital revolution? How do you look at software? You can look at immigrants, right? So immigrants become the face of a changing world, of your changing world, and you can see it and think, oh my God, we're not in Kansas anymore. And I feel like my world is being roiled. My world is, I'm not, the phrase that was used by posters in both Brexit and when the first Trump campaign was, do you feel like your country is no longer the one you grew up in? And you'd get these extraordinary numbers, 50% saying yes, and things like that. That's all about immigration, because immigration is the face of all these changes. And it becomes, you're always looking at somebody to blame. At the end of the day, it's a human reaction. I don't even think of it as I try not to think of it as so negative, right? You're just trying to make sense of it all. And, on the one hand, you could say, well, this is all part of vast impersonal forces that have been unlocked by, mysterious, complex historical phenomena that nobody is in particular responsible for. Or you can say it's all those damned immigrants. And that second answer is much more attractive and, tangible. The female thing, I think, is particularly important, because I think we don't realize just what a big shift has taken place in human society. If you look at race relations, ethnic relations, yes, the one group has tended to dominate the other, but that's always been true. There's always been a group on top, and they've been they've oppressed the others, and that's the story of human history. But in all those stories, one group has consistently been at the bottom: women. Not the bottom maybe, but there's always been second-class citizens, every human society we know of. And that has changed in the last 40 years, thank God. And you have taken the most basic social unit of humankind, and you've taken the hierarchy within it, the power relations within it, and said, instead of being hierarchical, it's going to be egalitarian. That's a big, big change. And I don't think we all recognize the degree to which some of these movements, some of this politics of nostalgia, is a subconscious desire to get to, it's a reaction to that. If you look at the religious conservative movements or religious nationalist movements around the world, Islamic fundamentalism, the movements in the Haredi in Israel, Christian nationalism, at the heart of them, there is this idea that we need to return to the traditional role, the gender roles, in some way, that we are in some way. I mean, the Islamic fundamentalists are the most blatant about it. Look at the Taliban in Afghanistan. First thing they want to do is they want to put the women out of school, put them back in the homes, cover their faces. But that's the most extreme version. But there is some uncertainty and discomfort with the complete shifting of that power relationship within the family and what it means. And so I think we're going to be living with that for a while. I think it's going to take a while. Look, as I say, we've had one kind of power relationship within the family for tens of thousands of years. It's going to take a while for people to get used to the new one.
Fascinating. And just keeping on time, I'll try to sneak in one or two more questions. And I think an interesting question was raised in our chat. If you could just talk a little bit about the importance of the Atlantic slave trade, specifically with the Dutch. They're a major theme in your book. How important, what maybe folks, especially students, might not realize how integrated the slave trade was to Dutch community, the Dutch world, and really the Atlantic world. If you could talk a little bit about that as well.
Sure. Yeah. So one part of globalization, and I talk about this very briefly in the book, but one part of the expansion of globalization was the expansion of trade in human beings, and the Dutch, in some senses, in the modern sense, pioneer that. Obviously, there've been slavery forever. What I wonder about sometimes is, again, the what ifs of history. If the Dutch had not triumphed, if the Mediterranean had not, so when the Dutch triumphed, what ends up happening is that the old Venetian trade, slave trade, and all that stuff that was happening out of the Mediterranean shuts down. And what ends up happening is you start to get this African slave trade. And so I wonder to myself sometimes, if you had not had that happen, the slaves would have largely come out of Asia, and they would have, in many ways, not been so physically different. And so what would the world look like in a world where, yes, you did have slavery in America, but it was a slavery of Caucasians? I mean, people literally coming out of the Caucasus. And would that be different? Would it make for a different kind, what would happen to the politics of the world? So there's a very interesting question there. But there's no question that the way you ended up with this massive slave trade coming out of Africa. It powered the economies of both the Caribbean and the South. And then it got a second boost technologically because of the cotton gin, but ultimately proved to be also economically a kind of a drag. But it stayed on as long as it did in its horrible moral form, because it all came, because the Dutch invented globalization. At that time, slavery was normal, so trading in slaves was as normal as trading in goods, and that began a whole process. So it is worth noting, again, we're talking about the rise of the liberal powers. The British Empire is responsible for the worldwide shutting down of the slave trade. And they did that largely out of altruistic reasons. They obviously were not able to shut it down in the United States, but it is true that the Royal Navy pretty much single-handedly shut down the global slave trade.
Fascinating. A question that you talked a little bit about with Gina, but I think it bears repeating just for our for some of our students, and I think it's a good one. Is can you just talk a little bit about the importance of studying, or the value rather, as a political scientist, of studying history?
Yeah, I think it goes beyond being a political scientist. I mean, it's the value of being an educated human being and of being particularly a citizen in a democracy. Look, I think we're in an age where everybody talks a lot about technology and software and coding and things like that. But I think, ironically, artificial intelligence is making it so that some of these things become more routine. It's, there's one thing that AI will be able to do very well, I think, is write code and handle Excel spreadsheets. But what it's not going to be so good at is figuring out the nuances of history, helping you understand your particular perspective, and how you emotionally and intellectually take in that history to inform your views about the present, your views as a citizen, and I think actually your views much more broadly as a human being, as a friend, as a parent. All of that is determined by what you think, who you admire in history, whom you don't. There's a certain sense in which we are all trying to try to live our lives in the shadow of what history we know. Sometimes it's just a family history, sometimes it's a broader history. So I've always thought of history as the fundamental profession and the fundamental education that everybody has to get, because it's not an education you get to do a trade. It's an education you get to live a life.
Fascinating. And perhaps this will be our final question before I throw it back to Gina for some final thoughts. But we have so many in the audience who are students and perhaps first-time voters in a federal sense coming up in a little bit. If you could just talk a little bit about how this book really could inform future revolutions. And I think just with a particular emphasis on the importance of voting and really civic engagement for our young attendees today. I don't know if that's a convoluted question, but I think it's a good place, I think, to leave us.
No, it's a very good look. The way I think about this is when you look at what we are confronting today, the one thing I think you should be aware of in terms of history is democracy is liberal democracies is a very recent phenomenon in human history. And they're quite fragile. And when you look at, for example, Germany, most people don't realize, but Germany was a very advanced country in the 1930s. Weimar Germany was probably the most sophisticated, well-conceived, well-constructed liberal democracy in the world, much more so than the United States. And, Germany was an extraordinarily advanced society, not just scientifically, which it was. Germany had won in 1933 more Nobel Prizes in science than Britain and the United States combined. So it's scientifically advanced, but it's also much more than that. If you ask yourself in 1933, the year Hitler comes to power, if you had to choose between being a Jew in Germany or a Black in America, which would you rather? It wasn't even close. I mean, if you were a Jew in Germany, you could be a judge, you could be a leading lawyer, you could be a leading banker. Bismarck's banker 50 years earlier had been Jewish, Schroeder. Whereas, I mean, life as a Black in America, I don't need to go on, right? So that society could collapse into Nazi dictatorship. And I'm not making an analogy. What I'm saying is these things are fragile. We think of institutions and we say, oh, we have lots of institutions, we have checks and balances. But Emerson once said, institutions are just lengthened shadows of men. At the end of the day, what is an institution? It's a set of agreed procedures. If the institution of Congress, for example, had agreed to do what Donald Trump asked them to do in January 6th of 2020, which was he asked them to decertify the election that had been a free and fair election that had taken place. The majority of the Republicans voted to decertify, even after the riot. It just so happened they had a minority. If they had the majority, you would have actually had a free and fair election overturned, and the continuation of which is essentially, you would have had a period of time which could only be described as a dictatorship, right? So we were not that far off. If Mike Pence had decided again to follow his boss's advice and do what he did. So, understanding that historical context matters enormously, because this is not all just, tales from the past. This is stuff we're living through every day. And so when you think about how to understand the world we're in, you can't understand it without history.
Fascinating. So many questions we didn't have time for. A great remedy for that is getting your hands on this fantastic book. It was really an honor. Gina, over to you for some final thoughts.
Yes, thank you, Fareed, for joining us today. It was such an honor to have you here. And again, as Ryan mentioned, if you get a book today at our bookshop, the affiliate commission we receive supports our programming for history teachers and students. And next week, we hope you'll join us. We welcome the author of A Passionate Mind and Restless Pursuit. And as always, you can go on gilderlehrman.org/bookbreaks and listen to 225 different scholar presentations, as well as History Now, documents, essays, the Hamilton Education Program, and so much more. Fareed, it was such an honor to have you here today. We are so grateful you took time out of your busy schedule to join us.
This was so much fun. Thank you for having me.
Right. Have a great day, everyone.